When you knit a hat flat with straight needles, seaming the back is the tricky bit. Learn how to do an invisible seam with mattress stitch in this step-by-step tutorial. I'm going to start seaming from the top of the hat. It's easy to use the long tail left after closing the top, and I find it easier to get a nice smooth crown working down. Mattress stitch is really cool because it makes an almost invisible seam. The tricky bit is knowing exactly where to put your needle. Once you're sure about that, it's a doddle. So first I'll explain where to work the seam in detail, but there's a start seaming timestamp if you want to skip ahead. The golden rule with mattress stitch is you work one stitch in from each side. That sounds simple enough, but stockinette edge stitches always look a bit messy. And where exactly do you put your needle to get this magic invisible seam? Well, if you look at the better behaved stitches in the middle of your knitting, you see that stockinette is made up of columns of V-shaped stitches. And if you stretch your knitting apart, you see little horizontal bars everywhere that look like rungs of a ladder. There's a ladder going down the middle of each V-shaped stitch column, and also a ladder between each stitch column. Next, let's look at our stockinette edges and identify the first and second stitches. If you start a few stitches in, it's easy enough to see the V-stitch columns. Counting out from here towards the edge, you'll see a last fairly clear V-stitch column and then a messier version curling around the back. To do mattress stitch, you work in the ladder between the first two stitch columns on each side, putting your needle through the bars. With a fairly orderly looking V-stitch column on one side of your needle and the messy edge stitch on the other. The idea is that the column of V-stitches from both sides end up lying right beside each other, looking like the middle of your knitting so that the seam is hard to see. One final important point is that because we're seaming from the top of the hat, our knitting will be upside down as we seam. So our stitch columns are made up of upside down V-shapes instead. Or you're looking for columns of arrows or chevrons that point upwards now instead of down. They actually look like little pairs of trousers to me. So you still work under the ladder bars, but you want arrows pointing up on one side of your needle instead. Right, let's get seaming. While you learn, it helps to pin the sides together first, so your seam stays even and lines up at the bottom, but it's not vital. Leave the top third open so you have space to work. Thread a tapestry needle with the long yarn tail from the top of your hat. I'm using a contrast colour here instead to make the demo clearer and to show you how invisible this seam really is. You always work mattress stitch one stitch in from each side. So starting on the opposite side to where your yarn tail is coming from, look for the first column of upward pointing arrows, or little trousers as I like to call them. Here it is, and technically this is the second stitch with the messy edge stitch to the left. If you pull apart gently, you see the horizontal ladder bars between the first and second stitch. We're always going to put our needle in this channel, putting it under a couple of bars at a time. So put your needle under the first two bars you can see and pull it through most of the way. Leave the yarn a bit loose at the opening. Now move to the other side and do the same thing. Look carefully for the first column of upside down V-shapes. You can see it here with just the messy curled edge to the right. Pull apart and you'll see the little horizontal bars between the first and second stitches. Put your needle through under the first two bars. Pull the yarn through loosely again. So now we've started the seam on both sides. That's actually the hard part over with. Because once you start in the right place, it's easy to see where to seam from now on. So go back to your first side and put your needle in the exact same spot you came up through, right where you see the loose yarn seam. Put it through under the next two bars you see in front of the needle and pull through loosely. Now do the same on the other side. Put Put your needle back down into the same place as before, bring it under the next 2 little bars you see across and pull it through gently. We start to see this nice loose zigzag pattern between the 2 sides. Let's do a bit more seaming. It's always the same step on each side. Put your needle into the exact same spot as before, go under the next 2 bars and pull through loosely. That's it. Then just do the same thing on the other side. Once you've done this several times on each side, it's time for the magic. We're going to make our seam disappear. All you do is hold the sides together and give your yarn a good long pull to close the seam. Hey presto, we have an invisible seam. Okay, it's not quite invisible, but if you look at the crown, the seam blends right in. Now if you really pull the seam apart, you can see little flecks of the contrast colour yarn I'm seaming with. But because you'll be using the same yarn you knit with, your seam will look, well, seamless. That's the magic of mattress stitch. Now just repeat these steps until the end of the stockinette, seaming a chunk at a time and then pulling to make the seam disappear. I'll share some tips for common problems as we go. It can be a bit tricky to start seaming again after you've pulled your seam because everything has tightened up. So tip 1 is to loosen the end of the seam, so it's easy to see exactly where to put your needle again. Follow the same simple steps to keep seaming. Switch to the opposite side, put your needle in the same spot as last time, bring it under the next 2 horizontal bars and pull through loosely. Repeat this several times. It's quick and easy once you get into the rhythm. Now sometimes the next 2 bars will be really close together and other times there'll be a larger gap between them. It's natural for hand knitting to vary like this, but once you always go under 2 bars at a time, your seam will line up just fine. Once you've seamed another chunk, say 5 or 6 times on each side, hold the sides together and pull to make your seam vanish. Now tip 2 is you may need to pull a couple of times to close all the seam, especially if you seam longer sections at a time. And tip 3 is to check the tension along your seam after each section. Feel along and around it. You want a nice, smooth, even seam. So if bits feel too tight or loose, gently pull at both sides and along the seam to adjust and even it out before you move on. While your seam should automatically line up on both sides, it's worth a quick check now and then if you didn't pin the sides together. Worst case, if you've gone astray and one side is a little longer, you don't have to spend ages undoing all your seam if you don't want to. Tip 4 is that you can fix uneven lengths by going under just 1 bar on the shorter side every second time until the lengths match. By still always going under 2 bars on the longer side, you seam a bit more fabric, which evens things out. Now this fix is really more of a hack, and your mattress stitch won't look quite as good. So tip 5 is to pin the sides together at the start until you're confident mattress stitching. This extra measure helps your hat edges line up perfectly. The magic of mattress stitch is it's nearly invisible on the outside, but here's how it looks on the inside. Because you work mattress stitch 1 stitch in from both sides, the 2 edge stitches make a raised ridge on the inside, and because I've used a contrast seam colour, you can see a line of straight stitches running down both sides of the ridge. While mattress stitch looks great and makes a secure seam, there's substantial seam bulk on the inside. So if you're making hats for sensitive heads, especially chemo caps, I recommend knitting them in the round instead, so they're seam free. See how to get started knitting hats in the round in the video linked on screen now and in the description below. Here's how the hat looks after seaming all the stockinette. It's not quite invisible, but it's a very subtle seam that will look even better once it's washed and blocked. Now it's time to seam the rib. You use the same loose side-to-side technique and pull at the end, but where you put your needle is different. So here's how to do mattress stitch for rib, step by step. 1x1 ribbing has clear knit stitch columns. If you stretch your ribbing out, you see purl stitch columns in between each knit stitch. To seam rib with mattress stitch, you want a knit stitch on both sides of the seam, so you seam into purl stitches on each side and this disappears in the middle. This invisible seam looks like the rest of your rib for a super neat finish. Just like with mattress stitch for stockinette, the key is knowing exactly where to put your needle. With stockinette, we worked one stitch in from each side. And if you have an odd number of rib stitches, you do the same here. But my pattern uses an even number of rib stitches, which is quite common. So that means the first stitch is a knit stitch on one side, but a purl stitch on the other. Now we want to seam into a purl stitch on both sides. So we'll still work one stitch in on the side that starts with a knit stitch. But this time we'll work into the very first stitch on the other side, because it's a purl column. So if you look at any purl stitch column, it's made up of U shapes, or smiles if you prefer. And then beside these there are N shapes, or frowns. So to get an invisible seam, we'll seam through the U shapes on one side and the N shapes on the other. It doesn't matter which side is which. Another change from stockinette mattress stitch is that we're going to seam every row here. Now the side that starts with a purl stitch only looks like it has half the number of rows at first glance. So my top tip when you're learning is to carefully count the rows on both sides first. If you stretch out the first purl stitch column and look closely, you realise there are more rows hiding there. Putting your needle through all the N shapes or U shapes makes them easy to count. You may find it easier to get at the N shapes on one side than the other. I've decided to go through the N shapes on the left side, so I'll need to go through U shapes on the right. Let's start seaming. So start on the opposite side to the last stitch as usual. I'm starting on the right, so I need to go through a U shape first. It's easy to see the first row of rib because you can see the little U-shaped bumps above the stockinette all along it. So I put my needle through the first U shape on the right side and pull through loosely as usual. Now on the left side, just above where I came up from the previous stitch, I'm looking for the N shape in the edge purl stitch. There it is. So I put my needle through the N and pull through loosely. Now back to the right side, and I go through the next U shape just above where I did the last stitch and pull through. Now back to the left side. It's harder to make out each individual row in the edge purl stitch, so stretch it out a bit to make sure you're not skipping a row. Then put your needle through the next N shape and pull through loosely. Then just repeat the same steps for every rib row. Just make sure you stick to one shape on each side. So I'm seaming through U-shaped stitches on the right and N shapes on the left. Once you reach the end, or run short of yarn like me, it's time for the magic. Give your seam a big pull and watch it disappear. When you pull apart the seam, you see N shapes beside U shapes, just like any other purl stitch in your rib. And because you'll be using matching yarn instead of a contrast colour, it really will look invisible. Once you've seamed all your rib, the final step is to weave in your end. If you used a long tail cast on, each stitch overlaps to give a nice curved edge. So I like to add an extra loop to this edge for a neat finish. I thread my yarn down through the curve on the right and then back up through the curve on the left, before weaving it into the inside of the hat. This sticks out in the contrast colour, but in the matching yarn colour it blends in nicely. All done! Hooray! I hope this tutorial makes seaming your hat simple, so you can wear it with pride. I've linked below to the free beginner beanie hat pattern used in this demo. Got any questions? Just comment below. Thanks for watching.